Sometimes, the scariest nights begin with the simplest decisions. A young woman seeking solitude finds herself in a place where safety is an illusion and the true horror lurks just beyond the door. What starts as a simple getaway turns into a night of terror she will never forget. After a long, grueling work week, all she wanted was an escape, a quiet place to unwind, away from the chaos of everyday life. But fate had other plans. The usual hotel, her sanctuary, was fully booked. As the evening grew darker, she found herself driving into the unknown, searching for any place to rest. That's when she saw it. A rundown motel, standing like a relic from a forgotten era. Cheap, convenient. Just for one night, or so she thought. The place looked neglected, its paint peeling, its sign barely lit, but exhaustion dulled her instincts, and she convinced herself it would be fine. The receptionist, an elderly man with hollow eyes, made an odd comment. She was the only woman staying alone. His words felt off, but she ignored them. As he handed her the key, he muttered something about keeping the curtains clean. A harmless quirk, she thought. But was it? His smile didn't reach his eyes. The way he hesitated before giving her the key sent a faint chill down her spine. Outside, an old white Acura idled in the parking lot, its driver hidden in the shadows. She shrugged off the unease, telling herself she was just being paranoid. Night fell. As she settled into her room, something felt off. The heavy curtains were open wide, revealing the darkness outside. A cold shiver crawled down her spine. Quickly, she shut them, trying to shake the creeping dread. But outside in the parking lot, a battered white Acura kept circling. A shadowy figure inside, watching, waiting. She locked the door, telling herself it was just her imagination. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The room felt too still, the silence too heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Later that night, the sound of shattering glass snapped her awake. Panic seized her chest. Heavy footsteps pounded against the door. Then came the furious banging, metal against wood. Someone was trying to break in. She hesitated, then made a mistake that could have cost her everything. She opened the door. The moment the chain stopped the door from fully swinging open, her breath caught in her throat. A man stood there, his eyes dark voids, his grin a twisted promise of violence. He clutched a fire extinguisher, the jagged edges of broken glass glittering on the floor. She slammed the door shut, her pulse hammering in her ears. The man was monstrous. His twisted grin, his unblinking stare. His eyes burned with an unspeakable hunger. He slammed the fire extinguisher against the door, cursing her, promising pain. She knew she had seconds. Then, fueled by sheer survival, she screamed, a roar of fury, not fear. He paused, startled. Then, flashlights flickered, voices in the distance. The man vanished into the night. The silence that followed was almost worse than the attack itself. She stood there, breathless, her body trembling. But she was alive. Morning arrived, but the horror hadn't faded. A rude call from the motel staff accused her of overstaying. As she stepped outside, the shattered glass remained, the door dented from the attack. The old man's kindness was gone. He accused her, called her a liar. But she knew the truth. She knew what had nearly happened. And she knew. She had barely escaped with her life. She drove away, but the fear stayed with her. Even now, in the dead of night, she can still hear it. The shattering glass, the pounding door, the voice promising suffering. Some roads lead you home. Others lead you straight into a nightmare, a long road trip, a simple overnight stay, nothing out of the ordinary. Just another stop before reaching home. But sometimes, the places we rest aren't empty. Sometimes they remember. And when the clock strikes 3, something wakes up. Something that walks unseen, knocking on the walls, playing a game no one ever wins. One restless night in a quiet Amarillo hotel changed everything. And when morning came, a single sentence confirmed the horror. This was no dream, no trick of the mind, and I was not the first. I will never stay there again. The road trip had been long. Days of endless highways, gas station stops, and the never-ending stretch of desert landscapes. My family and I were tired, drained from the hours behind the wheel. But as we pulled into a small roadside hotel in Amarillo, Texas, something felt off. Maybe it was the way the neon sign flickered erratically, or how the parking lot seemed almost too empty for a place just off the interstate. We checked in around 9:30 p.m. My parents and younger sister were exhausted, but I wasn't. I've always been a night owl, always felt more alive when the world was quiet. But that night, the quiet was different. It wasn't peaceful, it was waiting. By 11:30 p.m., my family had collapsed into their beds. My parents were already snoring, my sister curled up under the blankets. But I couldn't sleep. Instead, I sat in the dim glow of my laptop, typing an essay for school, while my headphones played horror podcasts in the background. Stories about skinwalkers, spirits, and eerie folklore whispered in my ears, feeding the restless energy that kept me awake. Outside, the wind brushed against the window. Inside, the glow of the digital clock marked the slow crawl of time. 2:30 a.m. My eyelids grew heavy. I shut my laptop, placed my phone on the nightstand, and slid under the covers. I told myself I'd sleep soon. But then, the clock reached 3 a.m., and the horror began. It started softly. A slow, deliberate step, then another. Heavy footfalls pacing up and down the hallway. At first, I thought it was a late guest checking in. But then, the knocking started. Not on our door, but the walls. Tap, 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 steady, rhythmic, almost playful. Then more footsteps. A second set, faster, lighter, like a child running. The sound reminded me of a game, a chase. But there were no laughing voices, no playful squeals. Only the pounding of feet on the thin carpet. The knocks growing louder, closer. My breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed at me to check the hallway, but I knew better. In horror stories, that's always the worst mistake. So I stayed still, heart hammering, whispering silent prayers. And just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. For what felt like forever, I stayed frozen. The silence was worse than the noise. It was thick, expectant, like something was still watching, still waiting. I glanced at the clock. 3:45 a.m., 3:50, the longest hour of my life, then 4 a.m. Like a switch being flipped, the air lightened, the pressure lifted. Whatever had been there was gone, or at least I prayed it was. Morning came, but relief never did. As soon as I could, I went to the front desk. I needed to know if anyone else had been awake, if someone had left their rooms around 3 a.m. The clerk barely reacted. She just gave a tired sigh and said, "No, sir. But don't worry, you're not the first to ask." My blood ran cold. We left without looking back. But I knew I wasn't leaving alone. Because sometimes things don't stay where they belong. Sometimes they follow. Some places should be forgotten. Some nights never truly end, and some things, they never let you go.